The cafe on the corner was buzzing that morning. Waiters rushed with trays, the smell of fresh coffee drifted out, and the city's wealthy elite moved through the glass doors like they owned the place. At the center table sat him, Mr. Rayan Malik, one of the richest men in the country. His dark suit looked like it had been stitched from midnight itself. His wristwatch alone could feed a family for years, and yet his eyes were somewhere far away. On the other side of the street, a boy no older than 12 stood barefoot on the pavement. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his stomach growled loud enough for even passers-by to notice. But his gaze wasn't on the food stalls or the bakery across the road. It was fixed on the man inside the cafe. The boy hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Finally, he gathered enough courage, crossed the street, and walked straight toward the Millionaire's table. The bodyguard moved to block him, but Rayan raised his hand, eyes still cold and distant. "Let him through," he said quietly. The boy stopped at the edge of the table. For a moment he said nothing, just stood there, watching the man before him with curiosity that seemed too deep for his age. Finally, his small voice broke the silence. "Do you cry from hunger too?" The cafe froze. Even the sound of spoons against china stopped. Rayan Malik looked up, startled, not by the question itself, but by the way it was asked. The boy wasn't whining. He wasn't begging. He asked it as if hunger was something everyone must feel at some point. "No," Rayan replied after a pause. "I don't cry from hunger." The boy tilted his head, almost disappointed by the answer. "Then why do your eyes look like mine?" he asked softly. The words cut deeper than any insult or plea could have. For a second, Rayan forgot about the expensive coffee in front of him, the investors waiting at the next table, or the reputation he had built over decades. His throat tightened. Everyone thought Rayan Malik was untouchable. They didn't know that behind the perfectly tailored suit, there was a father who had buried his only son 3 years ago, a father who had never forgiven himself. He didn't answer the boy's question. He couldn't. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit," he said quietly. The boy hesitated, then slid into the chair, his eyes still locked on the Millionaire's. Neither of them knew it yet. But this was the beginning of a story that would change them both forever. Because the boy didn't just look like Rayan's son. He reminded him of everything he had lost. The next evening, Elias found himself sitting in the corner booth of a quiet family restaurant. The owner had given them privacy, perhaps sensing the oddity of the meeting, a boy dressed in worn-out clothes, and a man whose watch alone could feed a village for a year. "Order anything you want," Elias said, sliding the menu toward the boy. But the boy just stared at him wide-eyed. I don't know what half of this is." Elias smiled faintly, though it felt rusty, like a muscle he hadn't used in years. "Then I'll order for both of us." When the food came, steaming plates of roast chicken, vegetables, and bread, the boy ate with a hunger Elias had only seen once before, in the eyes of his own son, Michael, after football practice. "Slow down," Elias said gently. "You'll make yourself sick." The boy paused, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry. It's just—" he hesitated. "It's been a while since I've eaten this much." Elias nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "What's your name?" "Caleb." "Do you live nearby?" "Sort of," Caleb replied, his voice dipping into something darker. "I used to live with my mom, but she's gone now." Gone. Elias knew that word too well. They ate in silence for a while. Caleb's eyes kept darting toward Elias's cufflinks, his gold pen, the small signs of wealth that seemed alien in his world. Finally, the boy blurted out the question that had been burning inside him since yesterday. You must have everything you want." "So Why were you crying? Elias froze. He hadn't realized Caleb had seen him in the park, tears slipping down his face. I was remembering someone, Elias said carefully. Someone I lost. Caleb tilted his head. Like a friend? No, Elias whispered. My son. The boy's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't say, I'm sorry, or that's sad. Instead, he asked softly, was he my age? Elias felt the breath leave his chest. Yes, almost exactly. For a moment, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of other diners faded into nothing. Caleb's gaze didn't leave his. Then maybe, the boy said slowly, maybe we can help each other not feel so alone. Elias blinked, startled by the innocence of it. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark, one he thought had died with his son, flickered back to life. Tomorrow, he decided he would see Caleb again. The days after our strange first meeting passed slowly, but I couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Every detail stuck in my mind. His bare feet on the cold pavement, the way he clutched that paper bag as if it was the only thing keeping him alive, and the way he looked at me with that mix of innocence and deep sadness. I told myself I shouldn't get involved. I was still dealing with my own grief. It had been 7 months since I lost Ethan, my only son. People said time would dull the pain, but that was a lie. Every day felt like the wound had been cut open again. Every laugh from a child in the park was a dagger to my chest. Still, there was something about this boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, the same age Ethan would have been right now. I tried to shake the thought away, but guilt gnawed at me. Why did I drive away that day? Why didn't I ask if he had somewhere to go? On the 4th day, fate decided for me I was walking. Back from the cemetery after leaving flowers for Ethan when I saw him again. Sitting on the curb outside a bakery, knees pulled to his chest. He wasn't begging, not even looking at people passing by. He was just staring at the ground. Something inside me broke. Without thinking, I walked over. You again, I said softly. He looked up and his eyes lit with recognition. For a brief moment, I saw relief. Then it faded, replaced by something like embarrassment. Sorry, he mumbled. I didn't mean to bother you before. You didn't bother me, I replied. I sat down beside him, ignoring the odd looks from people passing. Are you hungry? His lips pressed together and he gave the smallest nod. I bought 2 sandwiches and a bottle of water from the bakery. When I handed one to him, he hesitated, as if unsure if he should accept. Then he took it, murmuring a soft, "Thank you." We ate in silence for a while before I asked, "Where are your parents?" He froze, chewing slowing until he stopped entirely. "They're not around," he said finally, eyes fixed on the sandwich in his hands. "Do you have somewhere to sleep?" He shrugged. Sometimes. I wanted to press further, but something told me he'd shut down if I did. Instead, I just said, "You can tell me if you ever need help." That's when he looked at me with that same piercing gaze he had the first day. And then, almost in a whisper, he asked again, but differently this time. "Do you cry from hunger too, or do you cry for something else?" I didn't answer right away, because in that moment I realized this wasn't just a hungry boy. There was a story behind his eyes, and it was far more complicated than I could have imagined. For the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about that boy more than I cared to admit. I couldn't explain why. I'd met countless people in my life, employees, business partners, clients, and even strangers asking for money. But that boy, he was different. His question had carved itself into my mind like a scar. One evening, I decided to take a walk through the park near my home. It was something I hadn't done in years. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the air was cool enough to make my breath visible. I walked past the benches, the playground, the small pond, and then I froze. On a cracked wooden bench under the dim glow of a street lamp sat the same boy. His head was down, his knees pulled to his chest, his thin arms wrapped around them. A torn backpack sat beside him. I hesitated before approaching. "You again," I said softly. He looked up, startled at first, but then recognition flashed in his eyes. "You're the man from the restaurant," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "What are you doing out here?" "Sleeping," he said simply, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Something inside me tightened. "Where are your parents?" He looked away. "Don't have any. Not anymore." I didn't know what to say to that. But before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind blew, knocking his backpack over. A few items spilled out, a tattered notebook, a small water bottle, and an old, crumpled photograph. The photo caught my attention immediately. I bent down and picked it up. My heart stopped. It was a picture of a young boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, sitting on someone's shoulders. And that someone was my son. I felt the blood drain from my face. Where did you get this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The boy looked confused. "It's my only picture. That's me when I was little. The man holding me, I don't know who he is. I just know my mom said he was a good man." I stared at the photograph, my hands shaking. That was my son, my boy who had been gone for years, the one I mourned every day. And this street kid had a picture with him, smiling, alive, years after he'd disappeared. My mind raced. Could it be? Was this just a cruel coincidence? Or was this boy somehow connected to my son's disappearance? The boy reached for the photograph gently. "Please give it back," he said. "It's all I have." I handed it back slowly, my eyes never leaving his face. I knew then. This meeting wasn't an accident, and I was going to find out the truth. That night, Richard sat at his massive oak desk, a single lamp illuminating stacks of documents, but none of them made sense to him. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about his son, Daniel. Daniel had been gone for 2 years now. It wasn't an accident or an illness, it was a choice. The boy had walked out one evening after a heated argument and never returned. Richard had spent months searching, pouring money into private investigators and police searches. But all leads ended in dead ends. The boy he once tucked into bed, the boy who used to laugh at his silly impressions, had vanished into the cold city. And now, tonight, that boy at the park had looked so much like him. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his temples. The boy's face haunted him, sharp jawline, messy hair, those stubborn eyes. They were Daniel's eyes. He reached for the decanter, pouring himself a drink, but stopped halfway. Instead, he set the glass down and picked up his phone. He didn't even know the boy's name, but he had to find out. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the poor boy, Ethan, sat under the same park bench where Richard had first seen him. Richard hesitated. That part of the city was dangerous, especially for someone like him. But he went anyway. Inside the station, he found Ethan sitting on the floor, drawing something on a scrap of cardboard with a piece of chalk. When Richard got closer, he froze. It was a portrait. A boy's face. Daniel's face. Richard's throat tightened. "Where did you see him?" he asked, his voice breaking. Ethan looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. "That's my brother," he said quietly. "Or at least, He used to be? Richard's heart pounded. What do you mean used to be? Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the chalk drawing as if the past was written in every line. Rain began to drizzle, soft at first, then heavier, making the streetlights glow like blurry stars. Daniel stayed on the bench outside the shelter, his coat pulled tightly around him, even though it did little to keep the cold from seeping into his bones. Inside, volunteers moved about, setting up hot soup and bread for the evening. He could smell it, and his stomach twisted painfully, but he didn't move. He wasn't here for the food. He was here because of the boy. The child, Eli, was sitting a few steps away, trying to fix the broken strap of his worn-out backpack. His small hands trembled, either from the cold or from the fear of losing the only thing he seemed to own. "You know," Daniel finally said, his voice breaking the silence between them, "it's easier if you knot it instead of trying to sew it." Eli glanced at him briefly, his eyes filled with suspicion. "It's my mother's sewing needle," he replied quietly. "I don't want to lose it." There was something in the way he said mother, like the word carried both hope and pain, that made Daniel's chest tighten. "Where is she now?" Daniel asked, already knowing from the boy's silence that the answer wouldn't be simple. "She's away," Eli muttered, looking down. "It's just me now." Daniel opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the shelter's door creaked open and a volunteer stepped out. "Sir," she said to Daniel, "you should come inside. You'll get sick in this weather." "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice sounded heavier than he intended. Eli hesitated, then whispered, "They won't let me in unless I sign my name, and I don't want them to find me." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Who's they?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted toward the busy street, scanning every passing car like he was expecting, dreading someone to appear. The rain was falling harder now, pooling on the sidewalk. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't just leave him here. But he also didn't want to scare him off by pushing too hard. Finally, he stood and said, "All right, if you won't go inside, then at least let me buy you something warm to eat. No names, no questions. Just food." Eli's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then he nodded. As they walked together toward the small diner across the street, Daniel kept glancing at him, this thin, shivering boy with guarded eyes. Something deep inside told him this meeting wasn't chance, and he didn't yet know. Eli's story would change his life forever. Edward had spent the night restless, replaying the boy's words over and over in his mind. "Do you cry from hunger too?" It wasn't just a question. It was an echo, something that struck deeper than pity. The next morning, he went back to the bakery street, determined to see the boy again. But the bench was empty. No barefoot child, no torn blanket, no hopeful eyes. Edward's heart sank. He asked the bakery owner, "The boy who sits here every day, do you know where he went?" The baker hesitated, then whispered, "He doesn't stay in one place. But I've seen him near the old train station at night." Edward didn't know why, but his pulse quickened. The old station was abandoned, a shell of its former self. Only rats and the desperate went there. By sundown, Edward stood at the rusted gates. The wind whistled through broken windows. He stepped inside, careful not to trip on the loose tiles. Then he heard it. A cough, small, weak. Following the sound, he found the boy sitting beside a fire made of scraps, holding a paper bag with stale bread. But he wasn't alone. Curled up against him was a little girl, no older than 5, fast asleep, her thin arms wrapped around his waist. Her hair was tangled, her dress torn, but her face was peaceful. The boy noticed Edward and stood up quickly, shielding the girl. "Don't come closer," he snapped. Edward raised his hands in surrender. "I just wanted to see if you were all right." The boy's eyes softened, but only slightly. "She's my sister," he said quietly. "We've been on our own for 2 years." Edward felt a knot in his throat. This wasn't just a hungry street boy. This was a protector, a brother, carrying a burden far heavier than his small shoulders could bear. "Where are your parents?" Edward asked. The boy's gaze dropped to the floor. "They're gone. I don't like talking about it." Edward didn't push. But as he looked at the 2 children huddled together in the cold, he knew he couldn't just walk away. That night, as Edward left the station, he made a silent vow. He would not only feed this boy, he would uncover the truth, because something told him the story behind these children's eyes was far darker than simple hunger. It had been a week since that first encounter between Victor and Daniel. The boy had kept coming to the park, sometimes in the mornings, sometimes in the afternoons, always sitting on that same bench with his little paper bag of bread crusts. Victor, despite himself, found his eyes searching for him whenever he passed by. The boy never begged, never looked pitiful on purpose. He just existed there quietly, feeding birds, watching people, scribbling in his worn notebook. On this particular cloudy afternoon, Victor stopped again. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the boy's shoulders sagged, like the weight of something invisible pressed down on him. Maybe it was the way his stomach twisted every time. He saw those thin wrists poking out of his sleeves. He sat down beside him without a word. The boy glanced up, surprised. "You again," Daniel said softly, almost like he'd been expecting him. Victor nodded. "Me again." For a few moments, they just watched the pigeons. One bird limped as it walked, its left wing dragging slightly. Daniel frowned at it, tearing a larger piece of bread and tossing it closer, so the weaker bird could eat first. "You take care of the smallest ones," Victor noted. "They're the ones nobody notices," Daniel replied. His voice was quiet, but it carried a strange maturity for someone so young. They fell silent again. Victor's phone buzzed, and for a split second, the name flashing on the screen froze him. Lucas. His thumb hovered over the green button before he locked the phone and shoved it back in his pocket. Daniel noticed. "That your son?" Victor froze. The question wasn't innocent. It was knowing, piercing. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "Do you see him a lot?" Daniel asked. Victor's throat tightened. "Not anymore." Daniel didn't push, just stared at the pigeons. And then, without looking at him, the boy asked, "Do you cry from hunger too?" The words hit Victor like a punch. He turned to look at the boy, startled. Daniel's expression was calm, too calm, like he'd been carrying that question for a long time. Victor opened his mouth but found no answer. It wasn't the kind of hunger Daniel was talking about, not just for food. It was the hunger of emptiness, of missing something you can't replace. And for the first time in years, Victor felt it again, sharp, raw, and unrelenting. The sound of the rain against the glass filled the silence between them. Outside, the world felt cold and gray. But inside, the air was thick with something unspoken. Ethan sat in his armchair, his eyes fixed on the fire. Yet his mind was far away, somewhere between grief and guilt. Liam sat across from him, knees drawn up to his chest. the oversized sweater swallowing his small frame. He had eaten well the past few days, better than he had in months. But there was still that look in his eyes, the look of a child who had learned too early that safety was temporary. Finally, Liam broke the silence. "You still think about him every day, don't you?" His voice was quiet, hesitant, as though he was afraid to intrude on Ethan's pain. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Every day," he admitted. "Some days I hate myself for not being able to stop it. Other days, I just feel empty." Liam studied him, then asked, almost in whisper, "Do you cry from hunger, too?" The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. Hunger. He had never been hungry. Not in the way Liam meant. But he knew the kind of hunger that hollowed you out all the same. The hunger for something or someone you could never get back. "Yes," Ethan said finally, his voice breaking. "But not for food." Liam nodded slowly, like he understood more than a boy his age should. And then, as if deciding something in his own heart, he slipped off the chair and walked over to Ethan. Without a word, he climbed onto his lap and rested his head against Ethan's chest. For the first time in months, Ethan's arms didn't feel empty. And for the first time in years, he didn't push the feeling away. He didn't realize it then. But that night marked the beginning of something neither of them had expected, a bond that would soon pull Ethan into a truth far more complicated and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Because Liam's past wasn't done catching up to him. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic creak of the old pipes and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ethan had carried Liam to bed hours ago, tucking him in with a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. But now, as the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan couldn't sleep. Something about the way Liam had clung to him earlier kept replaying in his mind, not just the sadness, but the strange knowing in his eyes. He padded down the hall toward his own room, but a soft sound made him pause. It was coming from Liam's room, murmurs almost too quiet to hear. Ethan stepped closer. "Don't. Please don't." Liam's voice was shaking, the words strained and desperate. "I'll be good. I promise." Ethan's stomach knotted. He pushed the door open just enough to see Liam thrashing lightly under the blanket. His face damp with sweat, eyes shut tight. It was a nightmare. Ethan stepped inside and crouched beside the bed. "Liam," he whispered gently, "it's okay. You're safe now." Liam's breathing hitched, his voice trembling. "They'll find me." Ethan froze. Who was they? Before he could ask, Liam jolted awake, sitting bolt upright, eyes wide and wild. He scanned the room as if expecting someone to be standing in the shadows. "Hey," Ethan said softly, resting a steady hand on his shoulder. "It's just me." Liam blinked at him, his breathing slowing. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Ethan lied. "Do you want to talk about it?" Liam shook his head quickly, clutching the blanket tighter. "No, talking makes it worse." Ethan hesitated. "Worse how?" But Liam only shook his head again and lay back down, curling into himself. Ethan stayed a moment longer, watching him drift back into uneasy sleep. But the words, "they'll find me," were now carved into his mind. Something told him that if they did find Liam, it wouldn't just be the boy in danger. It would be both of them. The boy's hands were trembling as he held the warm cup of tea the butler had given him. He sat on a velvet armchair,